Hello, welcome everyone. This is day 2 of the Netlify Power User Series. We have some really exciting content today for you, all about the Netlify workflow and release management. I'll give folks a couple of minutes to hop on to our live stream webinar event today. I know yesterday, everybody who was jumping on chat was sharing what part of the world they were in. If you want to introduce yourself, please do so. We're going to have live chat going and also Q&A during the session today too. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Melanie Chrissy. I'm a product marketing manager here at Netlify. I'm going to be your MC. And if you want to find me, I'm available Twitter, LinkedIn, Jamstack, Discord, all of those places where we can find each other online. Be sure to reach out. I'd love to meet you and hear what you're building. Today, our housekeeping is going to be very similar to yesterday. So we will record this entire presentation, all of the slides that you're seeing today and content, the videos, anything that is included in this, we will have available for you to reference after. So don't feel like you got to spend your entire time screenshotting what's on the screen. These materials will be available for you to reference. We'll get them out to you by email so that you can re-review them or share them with your team if you're interested. And we will be following the Jamstack community code of conduct. So be kind, be polite, watch your P's and Q's. We're here to have a really good time, but this is a professional environment. It's a learning environment. We can be casual, we can have fun, but we're going to be polite and keep things really light and fresh in the chat. So just, be careful with your words as you're typing things in so that we can keep that engagement going throughout the entire series. Today's topic is shipping and iterating fast at scale, so much at scale, how to release more frequently and reliably. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We've got Todd Morey from the product marketing team here with us today. And we've got Bhavana Srinivas from our solutions engineering team. Bhavana, why don't you lead us into what you have to share?
Let's do it. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you here. Going to go ahead and share my screen and kick things off. All right, so like Melanie just said, Todd and I are here to talk about release management, the challenges that come with it, and how to overcome them while shipping your web properties and web applications quickly and with more confidence. So Todd, kick us off.
And so the first slide here is this classic figure 8 diagram of release management. And even if you're not quite familiar with the sort of domain of release management, it comes from software development. And the big takeaway here is just this really tight integration from code development to building, to testing, operating each release, and then bringing that data back in to measure and plan for the next release. But this whole workflow and process is actually why we started Netlify in the first place, is to bring the rigor of release management into web development. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit.
Yeah, and like Todd mentioned, like release management involves a lot of moving parts. As your teams build out more or bigger applications, these things can get a little overwhelming. And so one of the biggest challenges we've seen teams face is just in terms of moving quickly has just been the amount of infrastructure that they have to own and manage between the development, staging, and production deployments. And the other thing is, like, while you want all these lower environments to match production, over time, they start to get out of sync. And so what you test in staging doesn't actually behave the same way in production because, things just get out of sync. And one other thing that also slows down team is contention over these resources. It's like one team's trying to build, they're using the staging environment, another team cannot use it. And so they have to wait. And all this is time that you can't spend actually shipping, but just waiting for that code to build and get that infrastructure. And as your front-end teams grow, you want these new team members to also be able to ship quickly, to be able to focus on building the application and not learning or managing the infrastructure. So these are things we've really heard from our different customers as to what is really hard to get right when they try to do release management. And in this session, we want to cover 6 different ways in which our enterprise customers, all the way from Peloton to Unilever, Affirm, and Spring, and Twilio, how they're shipping these rich modern web applications quickly, efficiently, and safely.
Yeah, so it's fun to be in our position to kind of see an overview of how all these different web teams are working. And I think the first takeaway that we'll talk through is for these teams, we're seeing them think a little bit differently about infrastructure as opposed to how you would traditionally. And then on the slide here, let me explain that a little bit. Sort of in the early days of the web or software development, we were, when we first started using centralized version control systems, like if anyone has used Subversion or SVN or has familiar with it, we tended to keep tight to a small collection of branches, partly because branching in Subversion centrally was just hard, right? So you had this small collection of branches, dev, perhaps for active dev work, staging for the work you're testing and reviewing, and then the main branch for what's going to production. And so paired with those, back one just real quick, paired with those branches were long-lived server environments, right? So, so the dev branch would deploy to a dev server, like a genuine server, and then same thing for staging and same thing for main. Now, this is where the contention of resources that Bhavana was talking about comes in. Devs working on active dev branch, question is, who broke the build, right? Staging for internal review and testing, but we can only kind of be testing one particular release at a time, so we got to wait to test that bug fix, et cetera. And then, of course, main was where the production application lived. So now if we go into sort of the Git model of branching, when Git came out for a development workflow, man, it just felt like magic, right? Because it went from centralized version control to distributed version control, where you could work with it easily locally, and any developer could easily branch at any time. And so this sort of set up this new workflow of branch often and merge back often, right? So so you do the work in these small bursts on these different branches. And so really, one of the killer features of Netlify deploy previews is that it gives every branch you create its own deploy preview, its own sort of running context, available at a link that you can continually access, right? So if you look at that model, there's an option that we've seen a lot of teams do where that classic setup of dev, staging, production sort of fades away, and you come to this idea of sort of essentially unlimited staging environments. And this can help teams embrace, it's classically been called like the GitHub flow because they popularized it. But this really nice workflow where you're always branching off that main production branch. And so first you identify the work that you want to do. Perhaps you're adding a new feature or fixing a bug. So you create a branch that's just scoped for that work. You make your changes in that branch, and then you can use those deploy previews to preview and share that work. And then when you're happy with it, open a pull request, merge it back in, and then delete the branch. So you could imagine from that scenario, like what a nice workflow that is to have sort of unlimited branches, but then paired with that, this new sort of evolution with these edge platforms like Netlify is unlimited staging environments so that you can deploy preview each branch independently.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to add here is like our front-end teams at Netlify, when we're building out our main.coms and the different applications, they've completely simplified this process. So they have the main branch, that's the production deploy. And like Todd just mentioned, every bug or feature is its own branch, but they literally work with just these deploy previews and the main branch. Like they've gone rid of all of these lower level environments, not saying this works for everyone, but it is possible to just simplify it so that everything you test can be tested on against a preview link. And if it looks good, you merge it and then it's pushed to production. So it can be as simple as that. But this brings up like the importance of just having different environments, right? Like typically you're working locally as a developer, and then maybe you have a dev environment where you test out your individual functionality and features. You run maybe unit tests there. And then what we've seen with staging is like, it needs to be a very reliable environment where it's very similar to production so that you can test that feature against the rest of the application and make sure it's all working together. But it has been hard to manage these environments and make sure they're identical to production, because your teams have to think about everything from the infrastructure, from CDN to load balancers, have similar rollback strategies, have similar failover strategies between these different environments. And it's costly to spin them up and maintain them. So things start to differ. But having a good staging environment that's identical to production can be such a delightful experience for a developer, because you can be so confident that what you're testing out with, say, production replica data works the way you expect it to work in staging and then also in production. So you can just like push much more confidently and push much more frequently as well. And that's kind of what the TunnelBear team saw as well, right? Like TunnelBear is a public VPN service based in Toronto, Canada. And there we work with Jared, who is managing the web development team. And what they did earlier is like they would spin up all these node servers. They had all these different infrastructure. They use Nginx to handle the edge logic. And every time they needed new infrastructure or a new environment, they had to ping the DevOps team. Either call somebody, put in a support ticket, wait till that infrastructure is now set up for the front-end team. And so his goal was to basically reduce the cost of not only the server spend, but also deploys, like just the time that the team is waiting for these different environments. And when they started using Netlify, they were able to improve the deploy speed by 10x. And also the front-end team just had the flexibility to create these environments when they needed it. They didn't have to call up support. They didn't have to call up DevOps. And so it just helps teams scale really, really quickly. And the way, like, you might be wondering, like, how is this actually possible, right? That's because for the uninitiated, Netlify basically provides a platform for a web development team where all of your web development workflows are brought together into this one platform. So everything from building to hosting and the infrastructure needed and the CI/CD pipelines in between is all provided by Netlify. So then your development, staging, testing, production, all these different environments are happening on the same global infrastructure. So when you connect, your Git repository to Netlify, each branch then becomes its own environment. It's using the same infrastructure, and you don't have to call up different teams, nor do you have to use a service like Terraform, for instance, to spin up this infrastructure. All that goes away. It's abstracted for you. And so it just helps teams move much more quickly in terms of spinning up this infrastructure. This is a topic that's very close to me. And like I mentioned, like the Netlify team has one way of doing it. It's just the main and the deploy previews, but different teams have different branching strategies. And so I just want to touch on a couple of them to show that you have full flexibility on how you can set up these different environments. The most common one that I see is this one, wherein there's a one-to-one mapping between your Git branches and the site on Netlify. So if you have main, staging, and dev branches, you can have those sites, those branch environments on Netlify as their own sites or instances, and they can all be accessed at a custom domain of your choice. The second option is to build all of these different branches as one site on Netlify, but Netlify will split them up as different contexts. So you'll have the production context, which you can access at your main subdomain. You can have your staging context or your staging branch that's on, staging / / or -- your site name.netlify.app. So you still have these unique environments, but they're not just a separate site. And then finally, this is an interesting pattern that's emerging because you can have one branch, but then build them out as separate sites on Netlify. And the reason is because maybe your production branch or your production site is going to be fully static. So you're using Next.js, you're going to use Next Export and build those as static assets. But maybe you also want to have a site that's literally used by your content teams for previews of your content. And that's when it's not going to be a static site, but you'd rather use Next SSR. So the code remains the same, the build command changes, and hence like the output of that site changes. So it's really possible to explore different environment and branching strategies on Netlify, and we can choose one that works for you all.
So if you're thinking kind of, if you're changing thinking from these sort of fixed environments to unlimited staging environments that, like Bhavana just said, can match your workflow and how you think about branching. The second things that we've seen teams embrace is thinking atomically about releases. And what I mean by that is, almost unique to web development, I'd say. The old model of it was that each release of your site, whether that's release of code or content, et cetera, it was continually modifying a running environment, right? So the environment that your site lived and performed in was continually changing, and that's one of the reasons it's so hard to keep like staging and sync with dev and production, et cetera. But the new model of an edge first platform like Netlify is for releases to be atomic. And what we mean by atomic simply is just self-contained, so that the release is sort of a snapshot in time for exactly of how the site looks at that moment. And very importantly, and we'll see in a moment, that means it's retrievable, which makes rollbacks so much easier and more predictable than they've been before. Earlier on the slide, you saw that the point that web development has become software development. I went through and found just some requirements from a software team building traditional like desktop and applications and games. And we don't have to touch on each one of these, but it's just exciting now that this has come to the web world. All the automation that allows these continuous check-ins right from Git. Every build is, again, atomic and has its own build number and even a version flag if you'd like. You can run tests against each build ahead of deploying them, so that you have that confidence in the build. And then, like I mentioned just a moment ago, all previous builds are archived with a history making rollbacks possible.
Yeah, and so when you think of both atomic releases and deploys, Netlify has really embodied that. So all of the code, the assets, and the configuration of a site are updated at once, so that a website can never be served in a partially updated state. And the workflow basically supports that, right? Like it was created to handle that. And this gives you the confidence that at any point, because of any deploy, this is how your site will look like. And this is what it'll be like if a visitor requests them. And so these deploys are not only atomic, but they're also immutable. So like Todd said, once you make a deploy, that doesn't change over time. So any changes that you make to your code or your content results in a whole new deploy. And so Netlify will just maintain all these deploys for you from when you started building it, so you can always roll back to an earlier version instantly without having to trigger a build. So let's see that in action.
Yeah, let me share my screen really quickly. So we're going to be walking through, so the Netlify UI, I'm sure a lot of folks here on this call are familiar with it, but I'm looking at my personal site now, and here's a list of the deploys. So the latest deploy you can see with that green flag is published, but like Bhavana said, I have the whole historical list of them. And then when I'm clicking into this deploy, I can preview it, right? So this is actually pulling up the site the way it looked at the time that this deploy was made, right? So this is sort of the time machine for the site. And then what I can do coming over here is publish this deploy, which will mark it as the live deploy for the website, right? So now when folks go to my domain name, they're seeing this previous deploy. And another feature that's a little bit advanced is you could stop auto publishing. So if I wanted to like freeze deployments for a moment, just to guarantee that I wasn't fixing things before main was affected, you can certainly do that. And then now, like, let's go back in and restore the site to the most current deploy. So it's really just that easy to manage. And you can see it here as a current deploy, what you see and experience on a Netlify site. And this is the power of those atomic deployments.
Mm-hmm.
And then so let me stop my. You got it.
Yeah. And so, rolling infrastructure, rolling it back has traditionally been very difficult, right? Like, because first of all, you need to find the deploy that works and you need to rebuild it. Or maybe you're spending time just like figuring out what went wrong with this deploy, make that change and then deploy it. But either way, it causes some kind of downtime for your end users. And you're just spending a lot of time at that moment instead of just being able to deploy back, actually fixing the code and like rebuilding it. And so what Netlify's rollbacks gives is just this peace of mind, right? Like knowing that you can roll back with a click of a button. Anyone on your Netlify team with the right permissions can do it. And then so you can first roll back and then go into debugging what was actually wrong with that last deploy. And like you saw, it's a one-click action. It immediately invalidates the cache and folks are seeing that previous working version on your site. So as you can see here, like this is a sentiment we hear from most customers. Just this fact that you can roll back just gives a lot of like web developers and their managers a lot of peace of mind when they're deploying.
So third, let's look at thinking atomically, again, in these nice sort of independent units about teams and projects, because this is an interesting thing that this edge infrastructure enables as well. And I'm going to talk from just, we build Netlify on Netlify, right? So every interaction you have with Netlify is powered through the same platform that our customers use. But the way we've kind of divided up the experience among teams is there's a dedicated team that works on the netlify.com, what we consider the marketing site, right? We have a docs team that builds out our documentation. And then, of course, our product team works on our apps. And you can notice below each one of these properties, it's actually a different stack that powers it, right? So our marketing site uses a site generator called Eleventy from Zach, who's actually working with us at Netlify, but it's a really popular open source project for building websites. And we've actually combined it to use Vue components as well. So you see Vue there. And then the S below is Sanity, our CMS, because most every marketing team has some sort of CMS-based workflow, right? But that's not as common with documentation. So if you look at that middle column, the documentation team is using a project called VuePress, which of course is still part of the Vue community, but that project exists to power documentation, right? So it helps get a lot of the navigation and search and formatting right. But the content doesn't live in Sanity. It actually lives in GitHub because there's a large movement for docs as code, right? Where you're keeping your docs in lockstep with your product code. And so for the docs team, having the content in GitHub is really a critical part of their workflow. And then if you look over the app team, app.netlify.com is a single page application built primarily in React that talks to those 4 boxes down there, some of the representative of some of the custom microservices we use. So when you click deploy, that triggers that action, et cetera. So you can see how just looking at this process, each team, when we're thinking kind of atomically like this, is enabled to set up the stack that makes their own unique workflow for what they're trying to accomplish really productive without fighting with the way another team might need it set up. And then here I wanted to show you on this next slide, one more iteration of it is that 11D Vue stack that we're using for our marketing site Was it compared with Sanity? That was a newer approach. That was an approach we evolved to. Our site originally was powered by a different generator called Hugo, and not using a CMS at all. It was also in content in GitHub, but that didn't fit the workflow of our marketing team. We couldn't enable everyone to participate and iterate fast enough. So we made the decision to evolve it to this new platform. And Bhavana will touch a little bit later on kind of how this works. But the interesting thing here is when we did the migration over, touching every page, getting every page over to this new stack would have just taken it too long to launch. So we focused on key pages, rebuilt the key pages in the new stack, but we're able to use the proxy features of Netlify to continue to bring all of the rest of the pages until they could be converted over from that old stack. So for a while, we actually had them two running in parallel, but from a customer experience, you'd never noticed because it was all from that single netlify.com domain.
Yeah. And if you think of projects like that's one way to do it, of course, where you have several repositories, one for each of your projects and one for your marketing site and one for the app, for instance. But we're also seeing a lot of teams like, Unilever and Peloton, they're using mono repos and they're connecting Netlify to build their docs, the application and the .com websites all from one repository. And so the same workflows applies to them as well, right? Meaning you can combine mono repos with build plugins on Netlify, which we'll cover, but you can basically trigger builds on only very specific applications based on changes made in the right folder within your repository. And so this is, again, another way to show that different teams can all work on multiple projects on Netlify from the same repository, from multiple repositories, but not actually have to contend for resources. They have full autonomy on theirs and don't have to wait on each other's builds. And so when we think of rollout, like Todd mentioned it, it's rarely that we see folks actually doing a big bang migration, right? Like going from one old site to a new site with a new stack on new infrastructure. And folks have most often told us like, yeah, we do green blue deployments, we do rolling deployments, we do canary deployments, and there's just so many ways to approach it. One thing that's in common is that no one's fond of it, and it usually fills teams with dread planning out this, smooth, no downtime migration and a rollout. And so first thing is like, first of all, the fact that you can roll back to a working version just makes it a little more peaceful to do a new deployment. But also what we've noticed is folks do like this gradual page by page, URL by URL, section by section rollout when they're migrating from an older stack to Netlify. And so how this is possible is it's illustrated a little on this image, but essentially at the edge, you can add these Netlify proxies. It's just logic that you're adding with each deploy. So that configuration applies to each specific deploy, where you're saying that if that requested asset is on Netlify, serve that straight from us, we proxy everything else from the existing stack. So this way you can just, if you're starting to build for instance, /docs, then you can slowly bring that over, serve that on Netlify, but everything else will be now so proxy from, say, your AWS infrastructure. So this just gives you, combining this with rollbacks and the unlimited staging environments, you don't really need to manage this blue-green deployment kind of two production versions only. You can have like infinite versions that you can always roll back to or roll forward with. And so this is an example, like I mentioned, 90% of our customers do this. So Crossroads Church is one, Apollo GraphQL is another that I want to highlight, wherein they started with one property, right? Like, so for instance, their doc site, and this alone was served on Netlify. Everything else was actually served from their other backend. And so the experience for the end user is still that they're on this main domain, www.apollographql.com, and they feel like they're just part of one site. But behind the scenes, you're serving different sections of your site from different infrastructure. And so they're able to manage almost 75 to 100 changes across their doc site alone using Netlify. This is per month. And they're slowly bringing on more and more of their site over to Netlify. So each of these different URLs could be their own sites on Netlify, have their own tech stack, like we showed with how we do with Netlify. But for the end user, they wouldn't know any of this. Like if you look at the docs.citrix.com, they have almost 125 different products there. And each of those products is a microsite on Netlify, but it's all under this domain of docs.citrix.com. And it's just like using some proxying magic, some redirect rules at the edge to make it happen.
So we talked about thinking differently about infrastructure, thinking atomically about both releases and teams. And so this fourth point is actually really exciting for dev teams, providing full visibility so that you can involve stakeholders early and often, right? Because the earlier an issue is raised or feedback is incorporated, the faster you can work on it, and the less likely it is to disrupt development or be painful to implement. And so for when I was on some dev teams, we just always felt like a black box. It was really hard to get to share out the work as we were working on it. And of course, deploy previews do a lot to solve for that. But the other question then is like, how do you gather and incorporate the feedback that folks have? And every deploy preview, this is optional, you can turn it off, but every deploy preview, fairly recently, we added to Netlify annotation tools, right? And I thought about demoing this part, but I won't go into the exact demo of it because it is what you expect. It allows you to record a video of what you're seeing on the screen, to do markups, to leave comments, that sort of thing. What's unique about it, one, of course, is that it's available with every preview, which is fantastic. So you just paste the deploy preview link, send it to others around the organization, and they can participate in the commenting like you see in the screenshot. But what's important to us too is we didn't want that feedback to be siloed in some new database somewhere sitting in a Netlify product. So we worked really hard, and we continue to add integrations to bring that feedback for your team directly in GitHub Issues, for example, if that's where you triage a lot of feedback, Trello, Asana, all kinds of different common development tools. So it's not trapped at Netlify, but actually flows into your workflow and the tools you're using. So if your team's not yet taking advantage of the commenting and annotation for deploy previews, it's certainly worth checking out.
Yeah, and honestly, this has been like a game changer because now product managers or say marketing folks can comment on that URL, on that page right there without having to log into Netlify, without having to log into Jira or GitHub or whichever service it is. So it really streamlines like how easily you can collect all that feedback. And so that's what we saw with live chat as well. So live chat is basically an online customer service software. They provide chat, they provide help desks and web analytics capabilities. And so before Netlify, they had this waterfall project model where the content writer who wrote the content passes it to the designer passes it to the developer passes it to the QA. And so it just like goes one stage to the next. But then like if feedback comes at any point, it's too late to like integrate that into the flow at that point, right? And so, but they ideally want to be able to integrate as soon as possible. So with the deploy previews, the automated builds, the instant rollback, they're just able to ship much more faster. So that's one thing I wanted to share, but there's also like a whole other use case for this, right? If you think of Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they have a product called the Landscape, which provides the world with like most up-to-date information about the top cloud native technologies. And this is a cloud sourced project. So they have folks from everywhere committing to Git and like adding, like contributing to the content on that particular page. So they need a model where they're still able to do some kind of sanity check and make sure that the information being added to the site is accurate. So for them, previewing what others were posting was absolutely critical. And so by using these kind of deploy previews, it's all branch-based and git-based for them, the content. So just made it more straightforward. Create a pull request, have this deploy preview, send your comments and feedback within that, and then approve and merge if you're okay with that feedback. So it just helps like developers not have to rethink what already exists, not have to rebuild some of the infrastructure, but just focus on building the application itself. Yeah, and then one of the things here is like, the other challenge is that, okay, Netlify is managing the infrastructure. We now have all of this being provided for the developers, but how do the DevOps and the release managers actually have visibility into this process? Like, if you don't have this kind of visibility, that's when you don't know what kind of data is flowing, you don't know what's working, what's not, and ultimately affects how fast you're able to deploy new releases. So having some kind of dashboards, alerts, and monitors around these deployments, the traffic patterns, and the capacity really helps teams successfully migrate. And so, the log drains functionality that Netlify offers does this, where you can connect all of your site and your function logs from site traffic and function logs from each site on Netlify over to a service of your choice, which you use for log monitoring. And so this can be connected to New Relic, Datadog, S3, Logflare, and we even have a very generic HTTP endpoint too, so you can connect to any service of your choice. And this list is going to keep growing. So combining this with, say, the build logs, the audit logs, and Netlify analytics, your teams can have full visibility as to who's setting up what CI/CD pipelines, who's deploying at any point, who pushed a bad deploy, and also just the visitor traffic to your site. So it gives you the control without having to manage and scale up the infrastructure yourself.
And one of the best things we brought from that kind of traditional software deployment process, release management, was being able to easily in a web workflow integrate automated testing. And this can happen on Netlify. We see some teams that plug it into their own existing CI/CD infrastructure that might be used for other backends, et cetera. But you can do a lot to set up testing automation, even if you're not running CI/CD separately or GitHub Actions or anything like that. We'll look at that in a minute. But the Netlify build lifecycle, that is all the steps that run when a build is triggered to run whatever software or site generators you've elected, all the steps you've put into the deployment optimization steps that we do, then that pushes it out globally. The teams did a great job, I think, of making each step of that build lifecycle pluggable, and so you can sort of control what happens at each step using APIs. And so a great example is to have your software, go ahead and build the website, but then run automated testing before the deployment even happens, right? So it's not against the live environment that customers are seeing. They're still looking at the prior build. But you can gate a build by running this testing and then decide what to do if that testing fails, right? Like, or if errors are incorporated. To the extent where you just you silently fail the build, it's still looking at the older version, and you can inspect and debug and get it up to your standards before retrying the deployment. And so let me demo that for just a second, how you can do that using Netlify plugins. And I bring that up because I talked about how you can talk to it programmatically. You can certainly write your own plugins, but we'll see in a second, there's a huge library of existing plugins where you can add automation to your site pretty quickly. Let me get my screen sharing again. And so if you can see the screen, back to my personal website, and each website has a plugins options. And so this is where I'm going to add new steps to the build process without even modifying any of my own code. So the first one up here is an accessibility plugin. This is, core to Netlify, so I'm going to put it on my site. This is kind of near and dear our hearts to make sure sites are audited for accessibility. And then another one that's interesting to look at, you can see we have quite a few of them, but let me scroll down here to the Lighthouse plugin, which is performance audits for a website, right? This is like what you can do in a browser, but this time you can do it automatically for each build. So my site now with just that has the accessibility plugin and the Lighthouse plugin installed. There wasn't anything else to do. So let me go ahead and trigger a new deploy of the site. which will bring us over to our deploy logs. If you used Netlify before, this will look familiar. It's fetching dependencies. So it's going to take just a minute, but right up until this point, it's going through the normal steps of the deploy, but the plugins know where and how to sort of insert themselves into the process. So let's give this deploy just a minute to get all the dependencies fired up. Okay, so here's the Netlify build plugin, and you see that last option. It's installing the plugins. There's the accessibility plugin coming first. Let's give it just a second. Lighthouse can take a moment to run as well, because it actually does it against testing infrastructure, right, to get those performance scores. But look at this. You see those sort of errors highlighted in purple? Those weren't there before. Those are there for that plugin, and that's actually what we want a bit, is like it's pointing out accessibility challenges, images on my site that don't have alt text, color contrast, things like that. So now if I go back to deploy, you see that top deploy down here. This has failed due to a plugin error, and that is actually the desired behavior, because we wanted that accessibility plugin to interrupt the deploy. And if you go to the docs here, let me scroll down to yeah, here we go. So you can see that one of the options we can set in this plugin is fail with issues, and so that gives our team the choice to say, look, if a color contrast or something like that isn't met or to our standards, don't allow that deploy to happen. No matter what developer pushes it, interrupt the build, keep the site where it is, and let us investigate. And so you see the site itself is still live, and it's not interrupted from a customer experience. It just gated that attempted deploy until those issues can be resolved in code. Okay, so I'll stop the share at that point.
I will take control, but I think plugins are so useful. And one thing I want to touch on is there's all these different flavors of plugins. So like he said, there's the Lighthouse ones if you care about performance, there's accessibility for that. And then there's this whole section of plugins, like a whole set around security and error monitoring, right? So this includes Snyk, Sentry, and New Relic that basically map application errors to a specific deploy. So it basically saves your team the time to identify and squish bugs, because you know exactly which deploy it was associated with, and hence what code was actually contributing to that. And then you can roll out versions quickly. And so we have a full session on this very topic, on how to integrate like New Relic with Netlify and what teams are seeing when they use it, how it can be used for this kind of plugins, as well as on the analysis and the analytics side, like what kind of dashboards and monitorings you can use to improve your performance of your site. So this one's really cool, but we have teams using all of these different plugins, right? And so Outfit 7 is a video game company. They have over 20 games, but they have more than 14 billion global downloads. So extremely high volume sites. And what they needed was, again, this ability to know in every single context for a bug, right? Like, so if I have a bug, or if I'm seeing an issue, or if they see like users are struggling with a certain feature, how do they know how to prioritize it? And by mapping it to Sentry, they're able to really check like which deploy caused what and what is the Git commit associated with it. So it just like, again, makes it really easy to install, but also really easy to identify the issue, so that with a very small team, you can deploy much faster. We're almost at the end, but I want to share like this, the mother of release management improvements here with Loblaw. So if you're from Canada, you probably associate with this brand. 85% of Canadians apparently shop in one of the Loblaw stores every week. That's because they have so many different brands and so many different web properties for each of these. And so when they started working with us, you know, each brand within Loblaw had their own tech stack. And every time they wanted to spin up a landing page or a web property, they would do the research starting from scratch. Like, what do we use? What's the tech stack? What's the functionality? And choose different vendors and services to make that happen. And so it just took really long. Like before Netlify, they released 9 products over 7 years. And what they did is they basically standardized using Netlify for any of their web properties. And so teams use the same infrastructure. They have the flexibility to choose the tech stack though, right? Like maybe some teams care about Gatsby and some like Vue and some like Next.js. So they can choose what they want, but it's all on that same infrastructure. So now if they hire a new developer and that person wants to now build a site, they just go to Netlify and spin it up, right? Like a lot of the workflow is handled for them. So after Netlify, they've released over 11 products in just 4 months, and this just continues to increase, right? So you can do much more with less once you standardize on infrastructure like this that provides most of these capabilities. And so we want to leave you here with this slide, which is that these are all very well-known brands and companies who came to us with very similar needs and requirements from a release management perspective. And the impact that they saw from Netlify is basically what we covered today, along with performance and security benefits. So if we're going to move into Q&A. So if you have any questions on how this would all work for you, we're happy to go into that now. But it was really nice chatting with you all, and we hope that you found this pretty useful.
This is so great. I think, yeah, let's get into, thank you so much, Bhavana and Todd, for like that very thorough walk through the release management build process with Netlify. It was so good to see some of the familiar features like deploy previews and build plugins introduced to everybody, and the chat's just been great. There have been a lot of questions. So some of the questions are more housekeeping focused. A lot of them are really in depth. So I'm going to cover the simpler ones first, just to get them out of the way, and then we'll dig in to some of these deeper use case questions. And if there's anything we don't feel comfortable answering today, we can just put it in our back pocket and follow up over email. So just know that if you get a stumper, Todd, just call it out, let me know, and we can do our research and get back to folks. But we did have one question, which is, as a general question, are there any published tutorial video series officially from Netlify? Right off the top of my head, there are 2 really great places to start if you're into video content. So one is we have the Jamstack Explorers website. If you just Google Jamstack Explorers, it should come up. That is just a whole bunch of really in-depth tutorials with different frameworks, different types of projects you might want to build. It's a great playground and a good place to start if you're just looking to build lots of different projects, and it will walk you through how to host those on Netlify. So good place to start there. But of course, on YouTube itself, Netlify also has a channel. There are playlists on that channel. There are certainly also tutorial series on that channel as well. So 2 places for video content if you're looking to learn. I think that was all. There was one other question, just I'm going to call it out just in case anybody else was wondering the same thing. We are recording all of this. All the slides will be available, but it's going to be the end of the series when we send everything out. So if you didn't get a link to the recording yesterday, that's okay. We didn't miss you or skip you. It's just going to be a little bit more time for all of the recordings to propagate and get us to get them ready to send to you, but they will go out shortly after the series wraps. So I'm thinking, you should get it before next week. And all right, so switching gears a little bit, questions for our speakers, our experts here on the line. I think this kind of got covered, but it's a good segue because we were just talking about this, so it should be fresh. What plugins do you suggest for deploying apps on the website, specifically looking for things that make it smoother and more reliable? I feel like we covered some good ones, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think my top 2 recommendations, just because they're so easy to get started with and probably surface the most concrete feedback to improve the experience right away, are the accessibility one that you saw installed, and then of course Lighthouse. I know a lot of developers. The Lighthouse is built right into the Google Chrome DevTools, which is awesome. But the unique aspect of putting Lighthouse into the build workflow is, again, that gating, right? So, previously deployment performance budgets were kind of hard for teams, right? It was a lot to set up, some extra infrastructure. This is a fantastic way to say, because performance is something that like, you aim for, you do a sprint to try to make the site really performant, and then it can kind of creep back a little bit slower over time as new features are added. And having an active performance budget that's enforced through your builds creates a great workflow where, developers are alerted when the site doesn't meet those standards, and then that build doesn't go live, and then you work to address it. Same thing with accessibility. If I'd had that plugin from the beginning, I wouldn't have been able to deploy that image without alt text. It just, it's everything developers strive for, but it's hard to kind of keep top of mind. So having it right there in the workflow really puts it in front of you. I'd say those two alone are just huge boosts for dev teams.
Yep.
I really like the cache one. So there's the Next.js cache, the Gatsby cache. Those are really useful if you're trying to work on a different kind of budget, which is your build times, and you want to reduce those. They make such a big difference. And then the functionality related ones, for instance, if your website has search, then with one click, you can have the Algolia plugin in there, and then that'll crawl your entire site. So it really depends on what you want, but there's some good ones in there.
Yeah. Okay. So related question, and I feel like I kind of know the answer, but not 100% sure. So I'm hoping one of y'all know exactly. But we did get a question: does Netlify charge for the runtime for the build plugin? So if I install a bunch of build plugins in my build, and it naturally makes my build time a little bit longer because there are more processes that have to run, does that get incurred in your build minutes? My guess is yes, but do y'all know?
Yes, it's part of the build, and hence it does count towards your build minutes, but the plans have different generous amounts of builds. So
right.
Yeah, and for most of the plugins, I would say that the impact is very minimal. I mean, I'd be surprised if it really is it creates an issue for budget as in currency. And then of course you see it's so easy to remove a plugin from a site as well, and you can certainly put those plugins on different sites as you're testing and stuff too. So
yeah, I mean, it seems really valuable to me because like you're doing the work for me. Like I would have to go open my DevTools and run a web page test or something. So it's nice that it's built in, but yes, you do, be careful if you're going to go install every single build plugin, you might be feeling that pain. So just be aware of that. All right, switching into some deeper questions, and we do only have 6 minutes. So we might not get to everything today. Everybody, please be patient with us, but I'm going to try to ask some of the ones that came up. We'll move as quickly as we can. There was a question from Sebastian about environment variables that I think is important to address, because right now you can set different environment variables for different like deploy contexts, like staging versus prod. But my understanding is you have to do it in the TOML file, and that will override, whatever environment variable settings you have in the UI. And so there's a question here about where we're going to make this more secure and less complicated in the future. I don't want to sell the entire roadmap, but I know this is one of our big initiatives that we're focusing on secret management. So I will just share that's top of mind for us. And I think we're going to have some really exciting things coming in the next couple of months that will solve some of these problems. But do either of you, Todd or Bhavana, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, you're not alone in wanting to full control over what environment variables are put in what context. You might have an environment variable that points your CMS to staging content, etc. Melanie, you are spot on with making sure to do it through the TOML, but we're working to bring even more of that into the UI that's there. And then if you haven't looked at it and it's appropriate for your backend applications, the biggest use of environment variables, of course, is setting those secrets for the auth tokens and such for the APIs that you're talking to. And one of the areas that we're working really hard is just to make that as seamless as possible, to get connected to a backend like Salesforce, for example, to get as close to one click as possible. And so Netlify Graph exposes this GraphQL endpoint. I think it's being chatted about in some of the other sessions. But one of the really unique things it does is it manages the secrets for you. So you don't even have to look at the environment variables for those particular connections. But it is absolutely an area of active development that we're, because that is it's a big thing for developers. So we're working to make it as easy as possible.
Yep. Great. Okay, great. One of the questions is about atomic deploys. So when I use that one-click rollback, will functions, serverless functions be included too?
Absolutely. Yeah. Bhavana, do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, for sure. So everything about your site, including the redirects, the functions, as well as the static assets, will all be rolled back. So yeah, so it's the entire deployment, which will roll back and then be in an atomic state.
Beautiful. Okay, two more complex questions. If we can push through them, I'd love to, because they're both great. So one of them is from someone named Michael. Michael asks, is there a way to promote a staging build to production without pushing it to the main Git branch immediately? For example, if I have a team that approves a staging build, can they like approve it and have it on hold before it goes to production without a Git commit being required? Is this possible?
So I'm going to speak to it the way I understand the question. You know, one thing you can do that you saw me do in the UI is pause automatic deployments, and we do this when we're trying to merge in quite a few branches, right? So that's like if we're doing a big release and changing quite a few things across those different smaller branches, we'll pause deployments so the site doesn't change at all visually. We'll get them all sort of deployed together, and then we'll push that content live, right? So you can do that if that helps address. The other thing that's fairly simple that might address what you're talking about is, of course, in the Netlify UI, you can set your live site, which is, you know, whatever domain you have configured for Netlify, to point to. You can change which branch it points to, right? So that is another way to bring content live without merging it back in domain, for example, right? Like, you know, Netlify deploys, I think, by default just from main branch. We're trying to guess as much as possible, but you are free to override that. And I've actually used that in development to do kind of just what you say, make the live site point to a branch even before it's merged back in.
I love that. So you can either like use your branch management to keep it from going live while you're waiting for approval, or you can use lock deploys, it sounds like. Okay, last question. We are at time, so I'm going to ask this last one, and then we'll hop off for the day. But Stuart says, my team is loving the individual testing environments created through build previews and the dev staging sites for our front-end Next.js app. Do you have any suggestions about how we can point our preview staging sites to different backend environments? So if you have different backend environments for staging versus prod, or deploy our backend, they have a Flask app with API routes in parallel with, or as smoothly as our front-end Next.js front-end on Netlify. Whew, that was a mouthful. Let me know if you need me to repeat anything or break it down.
I get it. And look, that's you know, that's an active area of interest for Netlify and the ecosystem. And so it's being addressed in a two-way. One, some of the more interesting backend providers like Supabase are looking towards versioned, databases, right? And that'll be really exciting because it'll be easier to keep that stuff in sync with the versions of the front-end code through Netlify. But I'd say like now, especially like with the Flask backend, and it's really taking advantage of those environment variables that are aware of context, bringing those into your code and doing quick logic checks just to make your code aware of which environment it's being deployed in and point to the right resource. I think we have a few blog posts that talk you through that, but I'll try to look those up.
Yeah, and then one thing I would also just add to that is maybe using the Netlify CI or the Netlify API so you can automate your backend builds along with frontend. So you lock your frontend build to a certain version, you run your backend builds, and then when that completes is when you trigger a build of your frontend application so that they're in sync, like one doesn't happen before the other finishes. So maybe that's another area to look into.
Yeah, and let me throw that in just real quick for those who aren't aware. If you're not using the local Netlify tools, they're fantastic because they handle the problem of bringing those environment variables that are set on Netlify right into the local development and workflow. So that's really nice as well.
Yep, CLI hype. Okay, wonderful. Well, I think with that, we will wrap up Q&A for today. Again, the recordings will go out at the end of the series. We'll try to send you links to the examples and things from all the content that was shared. So if you're waiting on that, that'll be soon. And Lisa, why don't you show us, I know that if you are working on a project where you need more assistance, you want to talk this through with an expert. Maybe you've been using Netlify for a side project, but you're ready to roll it out with your team at work. If that is the state of the world that you are in and you want to engage with us, this little QR code on screen will take you to our contact us form. You can also find that on our website if you just click contact us. And we will be happy to talk with you about your challenges, your projects, your goals. We have an amazing, very, very helpful team, and people like Bhavana are on that team. So if you're lucky, you might get to connect with her again. But I think that's it for the day. Thank you everyone for staying on. I'm so glad to be here with you. There were so many great questions. Chat was just blowing up. So I appreciate the attention, and we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow's session is all about web performance. We're going to be here with Aaron from New Relic. So if you care about making things fast and reliable, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.